Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. We're super excited to have a great talk today from Zhiyan Wu called The Mighty Girl, Family Vulnerability and Gender Homophily in Male-Led Ventures. So Zhiyan will be talking for 25 minutes, and then we're very lucky to have, I see Olenka's here now. Hi, Olenka. Olenka is going to be the discussant, and after Zhiyan presents, Olenka Kacperczyk is going to do a discussion for 10 minutes. So 25-minute presentation, 10-minute discussion, then about 20 minutes for Q&A. As Zhiyan talks, if you have clarifying questions, please put them in the chat, and Liz or I can interrupt if they're truly clarifying. Otherwise, we'll hold them to the end for the Q&A session, and you can always raise your hand during that session, type it in chat, whatever, and we'll hopefully have a very lively and engaging discussion for Zhiyan. Z, the floor is yours now, so feel free to share your
All right,
slides.
thanks, Colleen. Yeah, I will share my screen. All right, and thanks to Liz, Colleen, and Robin, and the Division of Entrepreneurship and Strategy of SMS for organizing this event. I'm very delighted to be here. Also, many thanks to Olenka to being my discussant of this paper. Also, thank you for everyone joining in. And I will just start presenting my work here, co-authored with my three wonderful colleagues in Sweden, Lucia Naldi, Karl Wennberg, and Timur Uman. So collectively, we investigate the relationship between family vulnerability and the gender homophily in male-led ventures. So a brief motivation of our project. So our research focuses on a phenomenon that is mostly in the male-led ventures. Typically, we focus on gender disparity there. So in male-led ventures, we see that female joiners are mostly underrepresented. And by female joiners, we mean that those women are hired into ventures by the founder CEO. And it could be employees, it could be board members, it could be the kind of sub-managers, middle managers in the ventures. And the key explanation for the underrepresentation of female joiners in male-led ventures mostly come from homophily literature. And in homophily literature, scholars argue that male founders likely associate with male joiners. And in this way, female joiners are likely to be selected into male-led ventures. It's more like a subconscious bias in the male founders' mentality, and they are more likely to associate with male joiners. And it seems to be an important issue in our society because business associations and media tend to sum up such homophily tendency as the gravity for the guys and criticizing male-led ventures as the boy club. So there are some scholar efforts and scholarly understanding how we can break the circle of gender homophily in the hiring processes. And mostly the previous studies focus on government-mandated gender quotas or union-led workplace diversity policies. But all of those studies, they actually centers on externally focused mechanism. So how external forces can break this kind of circle of gender homophily. There seems to be a conceptual gap about the inwardly oriented mechanism through which male founders can actually self-correct or regulate their homophily tendency in the hiring process. And this conceptual omission actually makes a lot of sense because it corresponds to a parallel gap in the broader literature on homophily. Because in that literature, scholars tend to assume homophily tendency function as a gravity-like force that individuals can hardly overcome. So that's why we need external forces to help correct these processes. And in addition to that, that literature also kind of conceptualizes homophily as a kind of ubiquitous across a wide range of contexts, rather than being conditioned by any characteristic of the individual decision makers. But just think about the phenomenon in addition to the theoretical understanding that we also see a kind of anomalous phenomenon that there is a quite heterogeneity in the female gender representation in male-led ventures. And our research question is motivated by this contrast, and we want to understand why some male founders can overcome their deep-seated gender homophily tendency and become more gender egalitarian in hiring, while others do not. So this drives our research project and be our research questions. So our initial thought was that we were inspired by the sociology of family literature on how family circumstance can influence or shape individuals' attitudinal development. And then we investigate a kind of a concept that we developed called family vulnerability, and how male founders' family vulnerability can influence his recruitments related to gender. And by definition, we define family vulnerability as the extent to which a male founder's immediate family is potentially vulnerable to the gendered norm in the society. So by definition, it's an objective fact rather than a subjective perception. So the family vulnerability is always there, but different individuals may have different perceptions. And we will leverage this distinction later in our empirics to test some and explore some potential mechanism. And we will talk about that a bit later. So our conjecture in a nutshell is that relative to those with little or no family vulnerabilities, male founders with greater family vulnerability are more likely to hire female joiners in their ventures. And our empirical approach is different from a theoretical developed one. So we have no hypothesis. We actually take an inductive large sample research design. So our strategy is more like a question-driven kind of research and let the data do the talking and see what we can kind of infer from the data, from the finding, kind of inform our theoretical development. So the justification is that the link between family vulnerability and the founder's gendered recruitments is theoretically complex, and they may involve various mechanisms at the same time. So it makes it at best ambiguous to develop highly tightly argued hypotheses based on established concept or distinct causal mechanism. So that's why we take this kind of inductive large N kind of design to kind of conduct our research. And there are 4 steps in our research procedures. First one, we want to identify whether there is a family vulnerability effect there. And then second, we want to see if the effect is always robust there across different check of robustness checks. And the third is that once we find a robustness effect there, we want to explore some mechanism, try to make sense of why family vulnerability happens and what can explain that. And based on all of those kind of empirical testing exploration, we try to infer from those findings and try to generate implications for future development in this regard. So when we go to the empirical design, there are some empirical challenges because family vulnerability can take many forms. It could be a working mother in the family, or it could be a working spouse in the family, but most of which are endogenously given because a male founder, how he chooses a married wife, and it's kind of endogenous choice rather than randomly assigned by nature. So our approach was kind of inspired by Washington 2008 AER paper. We identify a children's gender as exogenously induced family vulnerability. So family vulnerability basically sets up the idea that once family has a woman in the family, then the family was kind of vulnerable to this kind of gender norm in the society. So our justification is that conditional on having a child, and the child gender was randomly assigned by nature. It's out of the couple's control, and it's unrelated to individual characteristic of the male founder, and also unrelated to his managerial characteristic in this regard. So upon having a child, being a father to a girl or a boy is kind of exogenously given to a male founder. And so our identification strategy is quite simple and straightforward. So we regress the recruitments on the number of daughters with a bunch of control variables and a bunch of fixed effects. The most important fixed effect we have is the total number of children, because it's our identification assumption that conditional on the total number of children, the number of daughters is exogenously given. So think about if I have 5 children. So among the 5 children, whether I have 2 daughters or 3 daughters is outside my control. It's randomly assigned by nature. So by setting up this identification strategy, we are actually doing a kind of between subject comparison. So those let's imagine we have 2 entrepreneurs, A and B, and they have the same number of children, but by randomly kind of causal experimental setting, someone happens to have 1 more daughter than the other. And then we see whether the 2 individuals have different behavior in the recruitment processes, whether someone will hire more women than the other. So this is our identification assumption, and we'll check about it later. But in terms of the regressions, if we find the daughter number is positively associated with recruitment of women, it actually doesn't say anything about regulating of homophily tendency. Because if having 1 daughter leads to hiring 1 more woman in the venture, it doesn't mean that the male founder was kind of gender egalitarian because he might be able to hire 10 more men in the same venture in the same year. Then it's still reinforcing the kind of homophily tendency. So to address this kind of issue, so we use seemingly unrelated regressions. So basically we have two dependent variables in our regressions. One is recruiting man, the other is recruiting woman. And we regress at the same time using SUR specification based on the partial overlapping of decision criteria, because there is only one position. So the decision to hire a woman or the decision to not hire a man is interrelated. And the nice thing about SUR regression is that we can compare the coefficients of beta 1 in the two regressions and see which is larger. Then we can compare whether the kind of fathering a daughter can lead to hiring more women than men in this regard. So we can better test our conjecture here. So in terms of data, we use the full population of newly incorporated ventures founded by solo male founders in Sweden from 2004 and 2017. And we have 200,000 venture year observations with 50,000 unique new ventures. So what we observe as female journalists here is board members and employees. But some of you might think that board members sometimes are leaders in our literature. But following private literature, we define female journalists as those who were hired by the founder CEO. So in Swedish context, the board members by law was hired by the founder CEO into the venture. So in this way, we label them as female journalists. And you may also wonder why we do not focus on managers, because later, as you see in the descriptive statistics, most of the ventures in our sample is quite small. Normally, they have 5 to 8 on average employees in our sample. So the founder CEO actually function as the manager himself, and he will just do not kind of hire additional manager in this regard. So we have limited kind of empirical variation in this regard. So that's why we now focus on manager. And to kind of address the skewness, and we log transform the dependent variable here. And in the dependent variable, you focus on the number of new hire in a given year. So a reason that we didn't focus on the co-founded ventures, because if we focus on those ventures, it's impossible to discern the family vulnerability effect is driven by what kind of factor. It could be driven by the kind of family vulnerability of the founding founders, but it could also be driven by the influence of non-founding founders because of their exposure to the co-founders' fatherhood, or the combination of two. So we really want to focus on the first one. So that's why we only focus on solo male founders who actually make the decision to hire, who actually suffer from this family vulnerability upon having a daughter in the family. So this shows the kind of descriptive results of our data. And I want to draw your attention to panel C, because there are some interesting insights there. Because on average, the founder's age in our sample is 48. So basically, they already have their children before they started their entrepreneurship. And 60% of them are in the marital status. And most often they have 2 children, and one of them is daughter. And this is the bin scatter plot of our raw data. Our relationships are conditional on the total number of children. So as you can see, this number of daughters increase. Actually, the founder are more likely to hire female into the venture, and the male are less likely to be hired into the venture. This just gives us some initial kind of evidence that our conjecture might be on the right way. And then we try to move to the regression analysis. And before we do that, we need to track whether our identification assumption is valid or not. And recall that our identification assumption is that conditional on the total number of children, the number of daughters is exogenous given. So if I have 5 children, whether I have 2 or 3 daughters was randomly assigned by nature is outside my control. But there is some kind of threats to this causal inference, because individuals might be practicing any type of gender selection activities, such as abortion or in vitro fertilization, then our sample would be biased. So theoretically speaking, abortion in Sweden was kind of illegal, so that impact should be minimum. And in vitro fertilization, this technology was quite common at current stage, but recall that the average age of the founder was about nearly 48 years old. So they have their children probably 20 years ago. And in that period, IVF perhaps was quite a rare technology and was also a very expensive one. So we do not expect that was kind of widely spread use for gender selection in that regard. But in any way, so the possibility could also be there. So what we did is we did an empirical check. So we did a t-test here. We compared the daughter ratio in our sample with what would be naturally expected in human populations. And we see no statistical difference between the two numbers. In this way, we think that our sample was not biased in this regard. So it reflects the natural expectation in terms of how many girls would be born in human population in this regard. And the second thread to the causal inference is that they do not do abortions or IVF, but they may have some gender-based fertility stopping heuristic. So if someone wants to have a son in the family, so the couple might keep having children until they're parenting at least one son, and then they will stop fertility. So this could be plausible in our context as well. It's because it's legal, and so we also check this. So we think about this: if parents employ such heuristic and to keep having children until parenting at least one son, then for those founders or families who have a daughter as the first child, then they must to have one more children in the family to at least have one son. So basically speaking, that the number of the total number of the children in the family would be in positive relationship with the gender of the first child. So what we did is that we regressed the total number of children on a dummy variable we call the first child is a girl, and we see no kind of significant relationship between the two. Then we think that this kind of gender-based fertility stopping heuristic might not be kind of plausible in our setting. And in our robustness check, we track this kind of assumption again later in a different way. With those assumptions being checked, then we move to our empirics. And the first one is the regression results of predicting director recruitment. And as you can see, in model 1, we have only independent variable and it's positively related with female recruitment, but negatively related with male recruitment. It's providing a kind of supportive evidence that these founders, upon having a daughter, they are actually trying to regulate their homophily tendency. They are trying to hiring more women, but less likely to hire men in this regard. And in model 2, we show that adding additional control, the results remain. And when we limited our sample to founders with children in model 3, the results remain. Also remains the same when we limited founders with 1 to 4 children, which is the most common number in our sample. The model 5 is an interesting one because in Swedish context, if a person, or in our case, if a man start up a business and by law, he needs to kind of having someone in the boardroom. So for most convenience case, those men or male founders are likely to put their wife in the boardroom. So it's much convenient and easy. And in this way, what we observe will not be homophily regulation. It will be just for convenience purpose. So for that reasons, we also kind of focus on non-family ventures in this regard, and we found our results remain. By family ventures, we identify them by seeing whether the CEO and board members sharing a same kind of a family ID in our data. So in terms of the effect size, relative to the mean value of female director recruitment, fathering a daughter leads to 20% increased likelihood of hiring female directors. So we think it's a relatively larger effect here. And we can replicate all the findings when we use employee recruitment as a dependent variable. And the effect size is about 4% increase in the likelihood of hiring female employees. Then we finish the most important and first step of our empirical processes. It's about effect discovery, and we find something there. And next step is that we want to track how robust this effect is. And the first thing we track is we want to see if there is a minimum number of daughters as a critical mass. So whether there should be a minimum daughter for family vulnerability to manifest. And we see that only having one daughter in our data, we see that only having one daughter is sufficiently enough for the family vulnerability effect to manifest. Even though with the number of daughters increase, the effect slightly increase a little bit, but not so much. And then we track whether there is a kind of issue about the birth order of the children, because for many families, the first child may be a shocking moment than the second child. So we wonder whether the kind of arrival of the daughter in terms of the birth order would also matter. In our empirical check, we find it doesn't matter. So as long as the daughter arrives in the family vulnerability effect will manifest. And third, we try to limit our sample to those founders and families who only have one children, wherein the fertility stopping heuristic are inapplicable. And in that sense, we also replicate our findings. And we also replicate our findings focusing on non-token heirs. And we also talk about self-selection, whether having a daughter actually made this male founder more likely to evolve into female-type business. And that drives the increase of female representation. And we see our results actually quite robust in female-dominant industry as well as male-dominant industry, and even robust in female atypical industries, such as the space industry. Yeah, even though there is a very limited supply of women in the industry, our results still remain there. And the results also remain when we focus on biological children rather than adopted children. Alternative measure of independent variables such as daughter ratio, dummy variable or founder with at least one daughter, or daughter-heavy founders, whether the founder have more daughter than the set, also remain robust. Alternative measure of dependent variable, alternative model specification also remain the same. Also, alternative measure, sample construction, our results are just robust across this conventional kind of robustness check. What is most important robustness check that we think is the last one? So it's about alternative channels of family vulnerability. So far we have talked about family vulnerability, always talk about daughter, but daughter might not be the only female members in a family. There could be other females in the family as well. So first thing we think about is in the male founder's extended family, in his father and mother's family. So the number of female siblings was kind of cause an experiment setting as well, because in that family, how many daughters was was given to that family was also naturally randomly assigned. And we can replicate our finding when we use the female siblings in male founders extended family. And we can also replicate our finding when we focus on a working spouse in a male founders nuclear family. But again, a working spouse was a kind of endogenous choice. So it's just a correlational evidence here. So summary of the inductive finding is that family vulnerability is readily subtle upon having a daughter and becomes slightly more subtle across the number of daughters. And it is not conditional on the birth order of the daughters, and the effect remains robust across various specifications and various technical specifications. Most importantly, family vulnerability effect can also manifest itself through other channels, such as female siblings or the working wife of the founder CEO. Now we move to the third step, and we have 4 mechanisms that we have in mind to propose and test. So the first one is vicarious learning. So we think about daughter and the founders actually change their behavior upon having a daughter. So we suspect that daughter might be an information channel for the founders to learn more about discrimination in our society. So the daughter might got discriminated in the school or in the workplace, and they tell the story in the family, then father learns. But if this learning story holds, then our effect should not emerge from the baby or the toddler daughters, because those daughters are not socialized yet. But we still find our effects manifest among these two groups of very little girls, and they are not socialized yet. So learning story or the informational channel was not the only kind of thing can explain our, so it's not driving our results in the set. And the second thing we focus is female socialization. So by female socialization, we mean that once having a potentially vulnerable woman in the family, then the male founder are physically exposed to them and emotionally connected to them. And this way, the socialization will increase the male founder's feminist sympathy and other regarding preferences. And this mechanism also makes a lot of sense. But the socialization mechanism has the assumption that the more socialized with those vulnerable women, the larger effect should we see. So we test this whether we see whether the effect is stronger when the daughters actually grow older, and we see in our results actually across the different age group of daughters, our results remain relatively stable and the same. So we think female socialization is not driving our results. The third one we explore is the benevolent sexism. So those founders, they got daughters in the family and they try to see the world differently, and they have this obligation to try to protect the woman in a way, but they might be still sexist, and they may still view women stereotypically and in restricted ways. And typically in the literature, they will say those guys will hire women into non-substantial positions such as secretaries, and are likely to provide them with management or professional positions that were deemed as masculine domain. And we try to test this as well. We focus on employee recruitment with substantial positions, by whether the position was managerial position or a position with that requires specific theoretical expertise, which is documented in the registers data. So when we limit our kind of positions into this kind of hiring positions, our results still remain. So it's not about benevolent sexism. The last thing that we try to explore is that maybe people are just routinely practice this gender thing without even conscientiously intending to do so. This is particularly true for the older guys or the older generations who actually grew up in a gendered environment. And because of the early imprint, they take granted that they take gender practice for granted. And then once they have a daughter, and they will tend to reflect, oh, what I have been doing is something wrong. I need to change. So we test whether this reflexibility is kind of plausible as a mechanism in our setting. So we leverage the natural experiment in Sweden. So in Sweden, 1980s, they have a legislation that banned gender discrimination in the workplace. So before that year, gender discrimination was kind of legal and allowed, but after that year was kind of illegal and we got punished. So we argue that the cohorts grew up before that 1980 years, and they have this kind of early imprint that gender practice was okay, and once they have daughter, and the family vulnerability effect will trigger more salient reflexivity for them. But for those who grew up in later cohorts, in a gender egalitarian environment, once having a daughter, it actually triggers little reflexibility, because in their mentality, gendered practice was kind of not subtle as those older cohorts. So we find the empirical support for this, even though it's not a direct test of reflexibility mechanism because of limitations of our observational data. And we acknowledge that there might be several other mechanisms might play at the same time. And our goal in the paper is not to uncover all the mechanisms. So our kind of goal is to take a first step to exploring some of the plausible mechanism and try to forward a theory. And so according to our test, we think gender-related reflexibility might be a plausible one. And then we go to the field. We have conducted interviews with 7 founders, and all of them have at least one daughter. And we asked them about how having a daughter or how having a child in general, and then later specifically having a daughter, changed their way of thinking and engender any behavior change in their personal life and professional life. And this is one of the founders gave us the response. And here's the quote. So we have a sports club for girls in town, and their elite team was in the top tier in Sweden, but nobody knows about it. And if you go and ask which is the best team in town, people will think about the other male team. And this female A team dropped out of the top tier since they didn't have enough resources. And there's my firm will now be sponsoring them, and in our company, we only sponsor female adult teams and female youth teams, and we do not sponsor male teams. And this is the behavioral change he gave us when we ask about related question. So in a nutshell, we finished the first 3 steps, and the last step is try to infer from the systematic findings from our empirical data and try to infer what we can learn and what we can inform for future research. So the first thing I think our contribution stays, our core contribution is to the gender homophily literature. So I think our contribution centers on individual agency in homophily association, because in private literature research, homophily was kind of routinely conceptualized as a gravity-like force that decision makers can hardly overcome. And that's why private research typically focus on externally oriented gender neutralization issues such as gender quotas. And our work instead take a different perspective. We show that homophily tendency can be regulated and dispelled. And we also show that inwardly oriented, this kind of reflexibility might be a key for someone to kind of have this kind of self-regulated tendency to regulate their homophily. And the second contribution to this literature is that private literature in this area tend to assume homophily as a general, universally applicable across different social contexts. It's applied in work, it's applied in family, it's applied in Netherlands, it's applied in the US. And our work take a different perspective because private work tend to assume the independence of different social contexts. And here we actually conceptualize the interdependence of different social contexts. And we say that there is a cross-contextual interface, such as family to work. And this may make individuals more reflexive about their own homophily tendency and hence conscientiously regulate such a tendency. All right, I think that's all I want to present. And thank you very much for your attention. Look forward to your comments.
Okay, all right, great. So let me just move this around. Okay, so I think we're all good. Okay, yeah, so good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending where you are. I'm Olenka Kacperczyk, and I just wanted to thank you, everyone, for showing up, and to the organizers for inviting me, and of course, for the great presentation. So I'm always more than happy to discuss a paper on gender and entrepreneurship because it's a topic that I actually deeply care about. So it was a real pleasure. So let me just jump right in. And so the main research question in this paper is why some male founders become more gender egalitarian in hiring while others do not. Or to put it in a different way, why do some startups appear to have more gender egalitarian hiring practices? And this, of course, is something that relates to a much broader question of how we can actually increase female representation in the startup economy. And so I'm hoping that here I don't have to convince anyone about just how exceedingly timely and important this topic really is, because we all know that government programs, universities, accelerators are all trying to pour a lot of money and resources to remove barriers that women commonly would face in entrepreneurship, and then to increase female representation in the entrepreneurial economy. And this is, of course, all because we know that the viability of entrepreneurial ecosystems strictly depends on the engagement of all individuals. But unfortunately, we also know that minorities, including women, are often being excluded from those benefits. And so just to show you some data, so this is data from the EU countries on minority representation among founders. And so what you see here is that women and minorities are indeed much underrepresented in the founders' roles. And so if we actually think about this female underrepresentation problem in Sweden, we can see that actually it's quite acute there, which is interesting, right? Because we often think about these Nordic countries as just being so egalitarian. And yet it seems that when you think about female representation among founders, then Sweden tends to fall way below the EU's average. And so the question here is, can we do anything to change this pattern? And so really here is where the paper, I think, comes in to offer a number of interesting insights on this topic. So let me first comment on the many strengths of the study. So let me emphasize really that this is a very nice piece. It's clear, it's coherent, it's well executed, and it's really nicely written. So I thank the authors for giving me the opportunity to read it. It was a real pleasure. Now, three things stood out for me the most, and they were, first, I think their focus on female joiners rather than founders, because we know that startup economy is composed not only of founders, it also involves joiners. But unfortunately, the literature so far has really devoted much less attention to the role of joiners, and more specifically to gender inequality among joiners. And so in that sense, I think that the paper really taps an understudied topic. Second, I thought this was a well thought-provoking paper, in part because I think it's counterintuitive in a sense of its implications. So if we actually believe the findings of the paper, then a logical conclusion to make is that, well, a significant portion of female underrepresentation in entrepreneurship can actually be explained by randomly varying factors like child gender. And so this raises a question to me whether perhaps we're overemphasizing the power of external interventions that all aim to remove external barriers that women face. And then last and but not the least important is that the paper has a really cool research design, which I'm sure all of you make notes of. And so this leverages random assignment of a child's gender to proxy for the founders' beliefs and values about gender egalitarianism. So we can think here about two different founders. So one would be Mark Zuckerberg, the other one would be Richard Branson, and it just so happens that both of them have 2 kids each, but the gender composition of those kids is actually quite different. So Mark, if you read the news, you would know he actually has 2 kids, and also they're 2 daughters, and they're really insanely cute. Now, Richard, it turns out, has a boy and a girl, and I think they used to be cute, but they're no longer so cute because they've actually grown up. So the underlying assumption here is that, well, neither of those founders could really choose the child's gender, or at least we would hope that they couldn't choose that. And even at the time, even now, it's actually not possible to do that in most countries. And so that means that we're really in the land of pure random assignment, and we can estimate the average causal treatment effect. And so if we follow the theory that the authors propose, then we would expect that Facebook would be much more egalitarian than Virgin Media. And so the authors, we know, don't look at Mark Zuckerberg, they don't look at Richard Branson, but they find the exactly same patterns in the context of the Swedish data. And they show that the number of daughters is indeed associated with hiring more women and fewer men for director, as well as regular employee positions, so including upper level roles. So these are not just token positions. And these results, as you saw yourself, seem to withstand extensive robustness checks. It seems that it's really, really hard to kill those results. So it's cool, it's captivating. Well, now, let me offer a few thoughts of how I think the authors could think of developing this paper further. So if I were writing this paper, the first issue that I would tackle would be framing. So currently the paper tries to contribute to homophily theories, and it's being framed as saying, well, everyone focused on external drivers of homophily, but look, we find evidence for inwardly oriented homophily mechanisms. So I think this framing is risky for 2 reasons. First, my understanding of the homophily literature is that it's fairly big and fairly complex, and much of it, I think, already focuses on individual preferences and values. So presumably they are all inwardly oriented as well. And so what I worry about is that if you keep this framing, you might be actually getting into unnecessary fights with reviewers over very, very specific drivers of homophily, which unfortunately, I'm afraid, your large-scale observational data cannot really disentangle decisively. Second, there is a risk of the so what question. So even if the reviewers are aligned and they're like, okay, you have a new driver of homophily, then I think the question that may be raised is, so what? Okay, you've shown us this specific driver, but tell us more. Why do we care? Why does it really matter if we know that people already have those preferences for homophilous relationship? And so my sense is that contribution to homophily theories may come incremental at best. So what to do is the question. So let me offer one suggestion here, which involves really claiming a much bigger contribution than what the authors are currently doing by joining a much broader conversation about gender inequality in entrepreneurship, but also women's advancement more generally. So I think you have an opportunity here to link your findings to the question of when do women advance in their careers, and what you bring to the table is evidence for this interesting role of the family gender composition. So that's the new determinant that you can shed light on. Now, if you actually follow this advice, and if you redirect the paper and change the framing, then I would also encourage you to do something else, and that involves thinking more deeply about the key assumptions in your paper. So currently, the underlying argument in the paper is this assumption that if we hire more women into startups, then we are helping their advancement. But my question here is it always the case? Or is it the case at all, in fact? Do startups really advance people's careers? And I especially wonder about that because there's this recent evidence from Denmark that being employed in a startup might actually be really detrimental for a worker's career, especially relative to being a wage worker. So this paper shows long-term earning losses to those who worked in startups rather than in established firms, because we know startups are not necessarily good jobs. Startups are volatile, they go bankrupt, they cease to exist, and they leave people unemployed. So what I would do is I would encourage the authors to really probe this assumption deeper. So it would be helpful to consider a bunch of other outcomes beyond recruitment alone. For example, wage, turnover, to probe any potential career consequences for women who are going to join those entrepreneurial firms. And I would also encourage you to think a little bit more about the long-term consequences, like outcomes such as female labor participation in the long-term wage gap as well. And here, let me be clear that I think all of it requires being much more specific, much clearer about the counterfactual, right? So right now the paper talks about joining a startup. Now the question I have is what is the counterfactual? What's the base rate here? So are women better off when they join startup relative to unemployment, relative to being wage workers? And so that's something that I would really encourage the authors to double click on. Now, interestingly, if you actually find that women's representation among startup hires ends up exacerbating inequality, gender inequality specifically, then I think it would be worthwhile to think a little bit deeper about, well, why then, how do we make sense of your findings? Why do founders promote gender equality by hiring more women to their startups rather than pursuing more efficient routes? So for example, why don't they just give their earnings to specialized nonprofits, to people who can really help women as well? And if startups are such bad jobs, then why don't we actually want to protect women from them? So you might just think a little bit more about whether this is an inefficient equilibrium and why it might exist. Okay, so now my final suggestion pertains to the mechanisms. So the paper makes significant efforts to test many mechanisms behind the main findings. And I would say it's really a textbook example of what should be done abductively. Now, the question for me that emerged from those analyses is what else is really different about couples having daughters, other than, of course, we might presume the parents' attitudes towards women being more egalitarian. So to find out if there's anything else that distinguishes these couples, I did a little research on couples with daughters. I don't have a daughter, in full disclosure, so I don't really have a good intuition. But after I actually did some research, unfortunately, I have some bad news to share, and apologies to those of you who do have daughters. So here's what I found. What I found is that it seems that in developed countries, having a daughter really increases the risk of a couple divorcing. And the odds are especially high when daughters are in their teenage years, but it's a strong effect across the board. And actually not only one, many studies seem to find this effect. So if we do take these findings seriously, it may actually suggest a slightly different causal mechanism. So it might be that the number of daughters actually may lead to divorce or family strife, and the latter might then increase some cognitive and financial strain on the founders. And finally, this could result in founders having less time, less resources to devote to their ventures. And so one manifestation of that could be that they go for cheaper, less fit workers to their ventures. And in the space of entrepreneurship, unfortunately, my sense is that women often are the cheaper labor, less experienced, less fit. Now, some of those concerns, I think, could be mitigated, and the authors already do that by controlling for venture performance, but others, like founders' attention or time, are not, they're very hard because they're unobserved. So therefore, I would encourage the authors to actually probe this alternative mechanism a little bit deeper by, for example, examining differences in wages of new hires. So is it the case that women are actually underpaid when they're being hired to new ventures, or by accounting for venture quality itself? So is the effect different across lifestyle versus growth ventures, or maybe ventures that actually have received financial capital? So capital meaning that they're less financially constrained. And then finally, maybe with the data, you could actually explore a little bit more the family dynamics. I feel like the registry data from Nordic countries can answer any question. It's like a magic ball. It answers any question you want. And so you could definitely look at divorce, and maybe there's something about, you know, does the founder beat his wife or something? Hopefully not, but you know, sort of something to proxy for strife. So anyway, I think this is all I have. This is a really nice paper and a great pleasure to read. So thanks for the opportunity. I'm happy to email more of my comments, but I'll stop here for now in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olenka, for wonderful comments. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think I learned a lot. It's always great. But Olenka, unfortunately, because you always do such a good job of discussing papers, I think you probably get invited to discuss. You'll continue to be invited to discuss more and more papers because it's always
always happy.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Olenka. So there are some questions in the chat, and so if the people who have put stuff in chat want to raise their hand and like bring the question verbally, that would be great. If others have questions that aren't in the chat yet that they want to discuss as well, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll go through as many questions as we can in the sort of 10 minutes that we have left. But it looks like Christina's got her hand up already, so go for it, Christina.
Yeah, no, I put this in the chat, but one thing that I was preoccupied with, and sorry, I came late, so maybe I missed some of the setup, but so I do have a daughter, and I have a son. And so being a woman, I probably learned less from having my daughter than maybe from my son. But I do feel that my prior coming into this was that this was really going to be a threshold effect. And so when you led with the number, I felt really like you were setting that up as the natural prior, as the natural expectation. And I was sort of sitting there shaking my head as a parent that really the first one really shifts some of this broad stereotype awareness. I'm not a psychologist or even a pretend sociologist. I'm, you know, an economist learning how to do a more rich set of studies and questions. In fact, I'm wading into inclusivity and hiring. So that's why I'm here to mostly learn. And if I'm saying something really stupid, I want to hear it sooner rather than later. But my prior was really the big learning was going to come with the first one. What you learn when you have more than one is how different they are, even though they share, you know, similar characteristics. So for my taste, I might not have led with, like, you know, whether you've got 3 daughters out of 5, just in terms of like easing the exposition and then getting more quickly to the one kid result.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. And if I understand correctly, so you mean I need to focus on the first daughter and rather than the increase of the number of daughters. Yeah, so actually we did it in the robustness check. So in our main analysis, we focus on the increase of number the daughters all between individuals, more strictly speaking. And so we also have this kind of test to see if there is kind of a minimum threshold for the vulnerability effect to emerge. And we found one daughter is sufficient enough for that effect to manifest, even though the additional daughter actually increase the effects a little bit, but not dramatically. So I think the finding is consistent with what you have said here is actually...
my point's not about, my point is more of an expositional point. It's more about the structure of your tables, the structure of your argument, and sort of where you start, because you got there eventually, but I was preoccupied with my own, subjective experience, which is not always informative, but it was a bit for me, a little bit distracting, just because it was, I think my experience is not unusual amongst parents. And so you might just be distracting your parent audience unnecessarily, I guess was a better way of saying what I wanted to say. So just maybe it's more about restructuring and where you start as you set up your argument, and what comes out as like a finding or a surprise shouldn't be buried so far back in the robustness.
All right, thank you, Christina. Yeah, I think that's a valid point. I do not have children, so I didn't expect the emotion that you mentioned. But I think I will discuss with my co-author whether we will restructure our how we represent our data and the findings in this way. Yeah, thank you for the comments. It's a quite valid one.
Elena. Hi, Elena.
Okay, hi everyone. Very nice paper. Really enjoyed hearing about it, and Olenka did a great job as a discussant. I would like to maybe second Olenka on her concern about the difference between the founders who start ventures with female employees and founders who start ventures with male employees. My concern was less about the difference in couples, more in the difference in their ventures, because usually the way individuals start firms, they investigate, they find the need within their family or close circle. For example, I have a child, I want a sport complex, I cannot find it on sale anywhere in my country. I start importing it for myself, and then I realize that others might also need it. If you're exposed to more female members of your family, perhaps you see more needs in female-oriented products. And therefore, the firms that you start are more sort of female population oriented, and naturally you may have more female employees there. One solution could be if you do matching between firms with founders who have more female kids and founders who have more male kids, and then see if your findings replicate on the matched sample. My second solution is, I know you focus only on male founders, but if the baseline is homophily, then it means that male founders are more likely to hire male employees, female founders are more likely to hire female employees. If I got it correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, when male founders are more exposed to daughters in their families, they learn more about female genders, they become more open to communicate it with females. That should also be replicated the other way around. If as a mother, as a female, I have boys and I have girls, so I'm just guessing that, I learn more about male, I become more open to communicate it with male. You should see the same thing being replicated for female founders. As a female founder has more male kids, she should be more likely to hire male employees. And that would be a nice robustness check if you have access to that data as well.
All right, thank you, Elena. I think the points are very valid. I have to be honest, we didn't thought about the two issues you mentioned, and we have the data, fortunately, so we can test whether female founders having son will change her behaviors in recruitment in the future. Yeah, so we can test this for sure, and we'll go for that. And in terms of the self-selection bias that you mentioned, they select into a female type business, and we had some tests in our robustness, but I agree, matching would be kind of another way to kind of reinforce this kind of self-selection bias is not there in our sample. So we will also try to explore data. So that should be plausible for us to do so as well. Yeah, thanks for the wonderful comments here.
Yeah, but a great study and good luck with developing it further.
All right, thank you, Alina. Yeah, glad you like it.
All right, Jingning.
Yes, long time no see, Zhiyan. So very
Hi, Jingning. Yeah.
learn from your research, and I actually learned a lot from your presentations, Olenka's review. So I don't have any daughters. I am myself a daughter, and I'm personally involved with the space industry a lot, as you mentioned in your talk that your results hold. And one of my like the closest mentor from the space industry, kind of the head of some space venture, he actually has 5 daughters, and he helped me a lot. So it's like, kind of resonate with that situation. So I only have one observation, since we have so many interesting conversation going on, is that when you offer your research question on your slides, when I read it, I just almost give me an impression that you assume all men have that gender tendency, that they have to overcome that tendency before they can accept women. But in reality, maybe people are just more open-minded. Maybe they just want to work with women. So that's when Olenka offered her perspective, like what this research is really about, what really the research question is. So I think, that makes sense. So it's not about the logic, it's more about the framing or the wording about that research question. Just want to share that, but thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Jingning. Yeah, that's a wonderful thought. Yeah, I agree. So we made a strong assumption that for homophily tendency to occur in our setting, and we try to counteract by investigating the role of children's gender. Yeah. But I think Olenka already made a kind of insightful point there. So if we reframe the paper in a way as Olenka suggested, I think that assumption would be kind of not in our paper anymore. Yeah. So we will go for some direction along that line to reframe the paper. I agree that the individual preferences of homophily has been investigated. Yeah, and better we reframe our paper. Yeah. Also, thank you, Olenka, for your wonderful comments. Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's about time to close for the session. I think, unless I'm wrong, Liz, am I right? It's time to close. Yes. All right. So thanks everyone so much for coming. I'm sure there's more conversations we have. So I'm sure Zhiyan would be happy to get those over email. We'll make sure that he gets the chat as well. And the next session will be in 2 weeks' time, and you can check the Entrepreneurship and Strategy Interest Group website for that. Thanks everyone. Thanks Olenka. Thanks Zhiyan. It's been a pleasure.